So thank you for having me here today, and I'm going to be providing an introductory talk on Kinarm Standard Tests. As with all medical products, the end goal of the Kinarm is really to have some sort of impact on patient care. But before you can get to treating someone, of course, you need to come up with a diagnosis, which actually starts with an assessment. And so, of course, we have some examples here of whether or not someone actually has a concussion or not. And if we look at the kinds of clinical assessments of brain function that are typically done right now, we have some examples here. And if you look at this one of touching the finger to the nose, this kind of assessment and many others like it that are currently in practice tend to have some sort of common problems, such as they can be subjective. They often have very coarse scales based on the subjective nature, which allows some sort of consistency. That, of course, then creates problems of being able to show improvement and such. They can have floor and ceiling effects. And of course, one of the biggest problems that can happen in many situations is that they end up being time consuming because there's all sorts of different tests that might need to be done. And so this is really the problem that we're trying to deal with in this with the Kinarm, is to try to rework how clinical assessment of brain function is done. And our vision is to try to automate this. We sort of like to think of it as a blood test for the brain. And the key factor here is that what we're actually going to be doing is looking at subject behavior. So we're going to try to assess brain function through measurements of subject behavior. And the solution that we're looking at is to use something called Interactive Robotics. And as part of the solution, this includes sort of a broad range of standardized tests. This includes cognitive, motor, and sensory function. And at this point, it's really designed and aimed for the clinical market, particular clinical research. So it encompasses a number of different things. First is there are a number of short tasks because, of course, we have to worry about fatigue. Things are standardized, which allows you to compare to work that other researchers have done. And of course, this is all based on age-matched normative comparisons, so you can actually have some sort of interpretation of your data, provide some relevance to what you're measuring. Why do we think interactive robotics is a useful tool to get down this path? And the first is recognizing that robots are inherently objective. By their nature, they don't have subjectivity like a clinician would have. They can both quantify and control limb motion. And so if you contrast that with something like motion capture, where you can quantify limb motion, being able to control it actually allows us to ask a lot of other interesting questions as well. Robotics can be combined with virtual reality, which can be used to then simulate more complex scenarios, again, allowing us to ask interesting questions. And the key thing is that we can use this tool to actually provide insight into motor, sensory, and cognitive brain function. So we're not just limiting ourselves to one area of the brain. Since robots are always controlled by computers, that means we can actually automate everything, which of course will greatly speed up the entire process. In terms of how we're approaching this, if we look at the brain, and this is obviously a simplification, but we can imagine that there's sort of three main functions of the brain. There's cognitive aspects, motor aspects, and sensory aspects. And the idea is, can we develop different tasks to probe these different aspects of brain function? Now, clearly I'm simplifying things, and although we like to classify tasks as falling under one of these three categories, the reality is, of course, any particular task is going to be some combination of cognition plus motor plus sensory. But generally speaking, any task can be is often going to have a more primary function, and so that's how we tend to categorize these. In terms of what a Kinarm standard test is made of, it includes a number of different things. First off, you have to have the task. You then have to have some sort of parameters or metrics that one measures out of the task. And then you need some way to have this be automatically collected, but also analyzed and for our purposes, we think it's important to have comparisons of those metrics that we've measured in terms of comparing to a normative database so that we understand what's a normal behavior. What I'm going to do in the next slides is go through some examples of the KST. I'm not going to go through all of them because it's quite a large battery now, but I'm going to pick one example from each of the three domains of cognition, motor, and sensory function. And this should hopefully give you a bit of understanding of the kinds of tasks that the Kinarm is capable of. First of these is the reverse visually guided reaching task. And this is an example of what we think of as a cognitive task. So if you watch this little movie here, you can see that what the subject is doing is they have this white dot that they're having to move from one red target to another red target. And as you can see, the white dot is actually moving in the opposite direction of the hand. Now, in this video, we can see the subject's hand, but in the actual experiment, the vision of the hand is blocked and the subject can't see it. And so this is kind of similar to a task that is commonly used in research called visually guided reaching. But the key is they have to override their natural inclination to move their hand towards the target. So this is why we call this a cognitive task, because there is this cognitive override that they have to actually use in order to perform the task successfully. And we measure a number of different parameters related to different aspects of the task. But perhaps more importantly is to take a little look at what the behavior actually looks like with, say, healthy controls versus someone who's got a cognitive deficit. So in this slide here, we've shown an example of assessing the left arm and then separately the right arm. And you can see movements going out to the target and then back. Surrounding these trajectories are time profiles of the velocity of the hand. And if you look at a subject, in this case, it's an example of someone with a transient ischemic attack. You can see that even though they perform the task reasonably well with their left arm, they end up having great difficulties with their right arm. You can see this both in the trajectory plots where their movements are no longer straight and in many cases are going in the wrong direction. But that's also clear in the hand speed plots surrounding this. As an example of a motor task, I'm going to talk about object hit briefly. This task you can see involves both arms. If I start the task, objects fall from the top of the screen and the subject is instructed simply to hit the balls as they drop towards them. I'm not going to play the whole task, but it starts out very slow and then speeds up and goes faster and faster until by the end, the task is going extremely fast. And the subjects, again, you can't tell from the video, but they actually feel a little haptic bump when they make contact so that they know that they've actually hit the task. And the idea here was to assess things like arm motor function. It's a bimanual task, look at bimanual motor planning, spatial attention. So we report a number of different parameters, obviously one related to overall score, but also a few that are related to different hand movements and intralimb differences. Again, what's perhaps more interesting is to look at some sample plots of behavior. I'll just briefly describe what this graphic is showing. The left part of this graph shows the left part of the workspace. The right part is obviously the right part of the workspace. But the y-axis is actually showing task progression. So the beginning of the task is shown up here, and the end of the task is shown down at the bottom. Anything in blue indicates when an object was hit, and anything by the left hand, anything in red shows an object hit by the right hand, and white means that they missed the object. So this is perhaps a bit clearer an example of a stroke subject where you can see this huge white section. So in this case, they basically completely ignored the right side of the workspace, and that was throughout the entire task. There's only a couple objects that were hit there, whereas they actually were able to use their left hand reasonably well throughout the left part of the workspace. So this person clearly was just putting their right hand right in front of them and not moving it. But you can also get different types of behavior. And here's again, another sort of typical example. In this case, a subject with a traumatic brain injury. At the beginning of the task, when everything is going slow, you can see that they actually are able to hit almost all the objects throughout the workspace, both to the left and right. But then as the task progresses, you start to see more and more white. In other words, they're missing more and more objects, particularly out of the two sides. They're just focusing on the middle area. So that's an example of a motor task. And then the third example I want to give you is the arm position matching task, which is an example of what we think of as a sensory task. Again, I'll play an example for you. And what's happening here is the robot is moving the subject's hand from one point to another. So that's they're moving the right hand. And the subject was instructed to move their left arm to mirror match. Again, vision is blocked. So even though we can see the subject's hand in this replay, during the experiment, they can't actually see it. And so for them to perform this task successfully, proprioception has to be working. Their arms have to be telling their brain where it is. They can't use vision to perform this task successfully. So clearly, sensory feedback for perception is a key part of this task. Do you know where your arm is? There has to be a bit of sensory feedback for control because you're using your other arm to indicate where it is. So this is really assessing both motor and parietal cortex. In terms of parameters that we report, we look at total accuracy, but we also look at how consistent you are, whether your world appears to be expanding or shrinking, and whether there's any shifts. And what I mean by that will be a bit clearer on this next slide. So again, I'm going to be showing you examples of subject behavior. And you'll notice once again that I've got a left arm assessment and a right arm assessment. So if I'm assessing the left arm, again, so there's a sensory task, what that means is I want to know, do you as a subject know where your left arm is? So in that case, the robot was moving the left arm. And then you as a subject were moving your right arm to mirror match. In terms of plotting the data, we take the subject's match and behavior and we sort of mirror it across midline to compare where you thought the arm was to where it actually was. A couple things you can note is that even in normal healthy control, it's not uncommon to get shifts, reasonably large shifts in the workspace. And you can also start to see there's some small ellipses there, and that gives a measure of the consistency. Each point is reached to actually 6 times, and so we can get an idea, well, are they consistently matching to the same place? And that's important when you start to see examples like this subject. Here you can see the ellipses are far, far, far bigger, so this subject really not being very consistent with where they're matching to, which kind of implies they don't really have a good idea of where their arm is. And that's certainly in contrast to this other subject, another subject with a stroke. And here you can see the ellipses are actually quite small. So the subject is getting and interpreting information in a consistent fashion from one trial to another. But their world has shrunk. And so the kind of deficit that they're having for stroke subject number 2 is clearly quite different than stroke subject number 1. And so, a key point when you look at stuff like this and you look at this data is it's not just did the subject fail, but how did they fail? So that's just a few examples of some of our tasks. As I mentioned earlier, and you saw from my slide, we have about 10 of them now. But this gives you an idea of the kinds of things that the robot can do, and also hopefully gives you a bit of an idea that these tasks are assessing different things, and for each of them we come up with these plots of behavior that give some indication of what it is the subject is doing. So I'm going to sort of switch now and talk a little bit about, well, what kinds of things can I actually do with the data that I've collected? There's a few different options you have. And I'm going to start with sort of the simplest one, which is just a qualitative analysis. And that's that you can review or replay task behavior. You can use this, you can use Dexterity Explorer, which is software that we provide freely and you can distribute to any of your colleagues. So if they have the data, they can select a subject, select the exam that's of interest and click play, and then they can replay it. So this is particularly useful under a number of conditions. One is if you just want to share with someone else who wasn't present when the subject performed, and they want to actually sort of see, okay, what actually happened here. It's also useful for you just to replay when you get results that perhaps don't surprise you. You're like, wow, is the subject really that bad? This allows you to sort of go back and actually ask that question. Next thing is you can generate a report. And this can be done both from Dexterity, but also from Dexterity Explorer. And what this does is it provides a summary of the subject's performance during the given exam. So if you were to select the exam and then click that highlighted icon, it'll confirm that this is the exam that you want, and then it'll end up generating a report. And you notice that this kind of graphic looks similar to what I showed you in that example earlier, because those graphics that I showed you earlier are straight from the reports. Each of our KST has its own unique graphic relevant to the type of task. So you can look at the reports there, and you can look at parameters and such. Then you can also do, and this is where your statistical analysis issues come up, is you can export all the parameter data. So by meta-analysis, I mean, I want to analyze the data I've collected from 10, 50, 100 subjects, whatever. I want to analyze it all together. And so this can be done from, you can go to Dexterity Explorer, you can click File, Export Analysis, and after you get through a couple of dialogues, it'll create a CSV file. So CSV files, of course, can be opened up in Excel with various statistical packages, and these contain all the data that you're going to need to perform your analysis. So it includes all the raw parameter scores, includes a few other things I'll talk about in a minute, but it also includes all the information like age, sex, and other relevant information that you might need in order to, say, group your subjects appropriately for your analysis. So assuming you're going down this path and you want to analyze, there's a couple things that you need to be aware of, because there are challenges with if you want to just go and do what I call this meta-analysis of raw parameter scores. And the first issue you have is that there are going to be age and or sex effects. So for example, reaction time is a good one that everybody knows. Unfortunately, as we get older, we get slower. So this is important because it means you can't just take subjects and group them all together, because a subject who is 80 years old is going to be quite different than a subject who's 20 years old. And so if you do not count for age or sex effects, then you're highly unlikely to be able to see anything useful in your data. Second challenge that can show up is that the distributions of a lot of parameters from these behavioral tasks and anyone else's behavioral tasks too, they tend to be non-normal. You're often going to get skewed distributions. The example I show here is from the trails task. This is a task that we have incorporated, but it's also one that's been used in the literature for many decades. And it's well known that one of the parameters, one of the key parameters from this task is skewed and non-normal. Well, why does that matter? Well, people always love to use statistical tests that make assumptions of normality. Well, guess what? You can't do that, or you shouldn't do that. And so that creates a problem. And the third problem I'm going to mention, which perhaps isn't obvious to you yet, but it's interpretability. So for example, in our task called visually guided reaching, we have a parameter called initial direction angle. Now imagine you have a subject and their initial direction angle was 3 degrees. Well, what does that mean? Okay, man, I know what 3 degrees is, but is that good? Is that bad? I have no idea. And I'm pretty sure you guys don't either. And the reality is, we are up to 10 tasks, and some of our tasks have, 3 or 4 parameters, others have 20. There is no way that anybody is going to remember what the normal range is for each of those parameters. And that's not even accounting for the fact that that normal range is going to be different for different age groups. And so it's, everything's got different units, different ranges, age dependencies. There's almost no reasonable way to take that raw data and know and say, oh yeah, I can tell you if that's good or bad. It's just not possible. Not unless you do something, what we like to think of as clever. And the solution that we've taken, and we're not unique to this is used throughout statistics, is you convert things to z-scores. So what a z-score is it indicates the number of standard deviations away from the mean that a subject's performance is. So this is a normal distribution. So if you have a z-score of 2, that means that you are 2 standard deviations above the mean. If you have a z-score of 0, that means you are right at the mean for the population. And what's important in terms of how we calculate z-scores is that our algorithm accounts for sex, age, and handedness effects. So it's not just taking the whole population as a whole and lumping them all together. We actually account for those things so that when we give a z-score, say a z-score of 1, that means, all right, here's you, for your age, your sex, and your handedness, you are 1 standard deviation above normal. So we're accounting for that. Second thing is we actually deskew the data. So we ensure that the data are all normally distributed. Again, this is really important because otherwise the z-score has no statistical meaning and it becomes worthless. The other nice thing is that this just means that now all parameters have a consistent interpretation. So if you aren't familiar with z-scores, well, that's okay. That's the only thing you need to learn. And you learn it once and it works for every parameter. So you don't need to go worry about, initial direction angle or any other parameter meaning, stuff like that. You just need to go, all right, what does a z-score of 1 mean? Oh yeah, that means that, we're whatever percentage above normal. Okay, so it's one thing that you need to learn if you're not familiar with it. And once you've learned it, it's now applicable everywhere. Just briefly, because people often want to know, we have over many years developed the algorithm that we use to calculate z-scores, and it goes through, there's a deskewing process, regression process, normalization process. We do account for and remove outliers, and there is iteration through this to ensure that the different steps aren't confounded by each other. There's more details about this in our user guide if you care, but this is just to provide a very brief overview that we have taken a lot of care in doing this. So just to reiterate the benefits of z-scores is that the first thing is you can now group all your subjects together for analysis. And again, that's because we're removing the effects of age and sex. It means now you can use many common and powerful tests, which assume normality, because we've now deskewed them and ensured that the z-scores are from a distribution that's approximately normal. And again, the last one is this consistency of interpretation. Z-scores, again, it has a standardized, widely understood meaning. And if you prefer working percentiles, it's easy to convert from a z-score to percentile. So that deals with all the individual parameters. So reaction time, initial direction angle, and all these other little parameters, which again, I'm not going to go through the details on. I would refer you to our user guides they have very detailed explanations. But what I want to get to is a question that many of our customers started asking years ago when we first started to introduce KST, which is, okay, well, did the subject pass? Because that's usually the first question subjects are going to ask. And quite frankly, it's a fairly relevant question because if they did pass, why should you bother looking at their individual z-scores or parameter scores? It doesn't matter. They're good. So it's kind of an important question to ask. And when we first started looking into this, we considered a number of different ways of answering this question. But one of the issues was that some KST only have 3 or 4 parameters, others have 20 or 30. So you can't just say, if they failed 2 parameters, they failed the task, because different tasks are different. So we came up with a new approach, and we've introduced something called task score, whose purpose is to address this question. So this task score shows up on the report, and it shows up above the parameters. And it is there, again, to answer the question, did the subject pass or fail? An important thing to understand is that this metric that we've created is consistent across all the tasks, so its interpretation is the same. So again, we've tried to take this approach of let's make this usable. And so all KST use the same scale for task scoring. And what it really does is it measures how far from optimal is a subject's performance. It's important to know that it's a one-sided score. And this is effectively what the cumulative distribution function looks like for task score. And what that means is, okay, what percentage of subjects will have a given task score? And what you'll notice is that, so subjects have a task score up to 1 covers 68.3% of the population. If you're familiar with the Gaussian distribution, you will go, oh, that sounds familiar, because a Gaussian distribution, if you go between plus or minus 1 standard deviation, it has a percentile of 68.3. Same thing as with task scores of 2 or 3. This is what the percentile equivalents are. And so if you're looking at subjects and you go, okay, they have a task score of 1.5. Okay, well, that means they're going to be somewhere in the 70th, 80th percentile. They're normal. Task score of 5, ooh, they're going to be way out there. And so again, it's the same scale is used across all of the different KST. And the other good thing is that it's effectively the same scale that you use for Z scores as well. Now I'm going to flip where the talk is going here a bit, and going to first of all just point out some of the applications of KST. The point of this slide is really to let people know that our customers are actually using it in a number of different areas. And then I'm going to show a couple different examples of how it's been used in some of these different applications, so you can try to get a sense of what kinds of things it can be used for. First example I want to give was actually done in stroke. So this is from Duclos et al. And they were looking at 2 tasks, a motor task and a sensory task. And so the motor task was the visually guided reaching task. The sensory task was this arm position matching task. And the question they asked, was there any correlation between these? And so with stroke subjects, they found that no, there isn't actually. You get some subjects who will pass both tasks, some that will fail both, some that will pass one, fail the other, and vice versa. So there's no correlation between sensory deficits and motor deficits, at least measured by these tasks, in stroke subjects. However, deficits in each of these tasks individually correlate with the FIM, which is a measure of their functional capabilities. And so the takeaway from this is that, okay, well, both sensory and motor deficits are going to have an impact on people's, subjects' activities of daily living. In other words, they're both important to understanding the kind of problems that these customers these patient groups are having. But if you measure one, you actually don't know anything about the other. So you can't just measure motor deficits and think, I have an understanding of the problems that my patient is having. No, you don't. You need to understand both motor and sensory deficits. This is another example of comparing. I'm using 2 tasks. This is a single subject just to show an example. In this particular subject, they ran both the visually guided reaching task. This is just moving from one point to another point, and then also the reverse visually guided reaching task, which is the example I showed earlier. So these tasks, from a motor perspective, are identical. The one difference is that in reverse visually guided reaching task, they have to have this cognitive override in terms of what they want to do. And what's important here is that you can see there's a massive difference between this single subject's behavior between the 2 of them. But imagine you had only run the reverse visually guided reaching task. If the only thing you had done was collected this data, you might come away and say, oh, they've got a huge problem with their affected arm. Well, they do, but what is the problem? Because you can see from the visually guided reaching task, it's not a motor deficit at all. It's only by running both of these tasks and looking at the difference in behavior in terms of being able to perform it successfully or not, that you can realize that this deficit down here is not a motor deficit at all. It's purely a cognitive deficit because they can reach smoothly and accurately as shown in visually guided reaching. So this gets to a large part of why we believe that having a large battery of tasks can often be really critical in terms of understanding what is actually going on in terms of brain function or dysfunction. going to give an example of another customer of ours, Dr. Ron Levy, who studies Parkinson's. And he's been looking at a number of different things. And this particular study, he was looking at the effects of treatment and can we measure how that treatment is working or not. And so there's obviously baseline, looking at drugs, deep brain stimulation, or both of those. So the bradykinesia score is a standard clinical score. And as you can see, okay, as you increase the dosage, things get better. And then when they looked at a parameter from visually guided reaching, they can go, oh, okay, look, performance is getting better. So, okay, we can basically measure what standard clinical scores can do, which is, that's great and that's useful. But that was only the first step that he did. The second step he did is say, well, okay, can we measure stuff that you can't measure right now out there? One of the problems that's known with Parkinson's and the various treatments is as the treatment gets stronger and stronger, you start to get some unwanted side effects. In particular, you can get increased impulsivity. They don't have good ways of measuring that right now. So he then looked at a couple other tasks from KSTs, the reverse visually guided reaching task, again, that one that I showed you earlier. And what they showed is that as the treatment gets stronger and stronger, they start to make more and more errors. In other words, this is an unwanted side effect that's happening here. And likewise with a task I didn't describe, object hit and avoid, but there's another one where the errors start to increase as the treatment gets stronger. And so he's excited about this because this now allows him to start asking the question, well, how do I titrate my dosage? Because obviously I want to have, if I give more dosage, great, the benefits will be better. But now I can also potentially start measuring the side effects in a quick and accurate fashion, because then I can start to say, ooh, that might be too much treatment, too much drugs, or too much brain stimulation, and that's going to create a problem. And so that's where his research is ongoing. So in terms of how KST and the Kinarm can work into your program, just going to sort of summarize a bunch of the different things that we've talked about here. And the first is, of course, we can talk about creating study protocols. Many of our customers use KST, but they often will do their own custom task programs. And so having a study protocol allows you to mix and match both of those and ensure that you collect data in a consistent fashion. So when you've done that, of course, you can collect your data. You can then review and replay it, as I showed you a bit earlier. You can then go to the step that I mentioned about exporting your Z scores. And it's important, this is just done automatically. When you go to export a CSV file, the Z scores are calculated automatically and put out into the CSV file for you. That allows you then to go to some sort of third-party tool, so your Excel or your statistical package, to then do your meta-analysis of your Z scores. But then it's also, I'd like to remind you to go back to Dexterity Explorer, because this is when you can generate images or movies for your publications and presentations, so that after you've analyzed your data, you can then present it in a fairly usable way for your publications and presentations. And to try to sort of summarize where we see a lot of the value of this KST is, the second word in KST is, standard. This is a standardized tool, and this is really important because we now have over 100 publications using KST. So if you want to be able to compare it to what other people are doing elsewhere, it's a huge value to have something that's standardized like this. We like to continually mention that this is not just a motor system. The Kinarm is there for assessing cognitive, motor, and sensory function. So it really allows you to look at sort of broad-based assessment of the brain. As I think you guys are aware, this is really ready to use out of the box. You can start collecting data right away. And because we already have these really large normative data sets that have allowed us to create these normative models that allow us to create these Z scores, you don't need to go through the pain of collecting control data, in particular the pain of trying to collect age match control data. As mentioned briefly in the last slide, you can use KST at the same time as using custom task programs. So, different problems require different solutions. And so it's important that we let you figure out what is the optimal solution for your problem. And as I said, many of our customers use both of these because different questions require different different solutions. And as shown in that slide earlier, just to remind people that this is really applicable to a broad range of clinical indications. A lot of the initial studies were certainly done on stroke because that's where it all started from. But as time has gone on, we're now up to 20 indications and growing because this really is a broad-based tool. I mean, the brain is used for all sorts of different things. And as we know, there's many different indications out there where the brain is affected either directly or indirectly. And so as a last little reminder to guide you on your way, there's lots of details on Kinarm Standard Tests in the user guides. So for example, there's scientific references, very detailed description of parameters and such. And I'd like to point out that we also ensure that there is a summary, what we call the KST summary, and it's posted in a public and citable place so that you can, in a public place so that you can cite it in your manuscripts methods. You don't have to then, repeat all the details in your own methods of your own papers. And so this is hopefully a useful tool to allow you to work on your research in that manner. And that would be the end of my presentation here. If you have any questions.